clerk will read out the names.
A very wonderful evening to you. Welcome to Parliament and Governance here on Independent Television, where Benin City, Nigeria. I am Uyi Agumofwegbe. That we have three arms of government has probably never been an issue. In fact, that for the most part is common knowledge. However, one issue of concern and often debate is how power is shared amongst these three arms of government. All right, it has always been an issue that creates controversies and then in most cases even brings conflicts. In many instances, people will talk about how that from their own assessment, the executive appears to, as it were, usurp the powers of both the legislature and the judiciary. In the case of Nigeria, that has always been the argument. But is that the reality we'll see? And if it is, what are the implications for us as a country and of course as a government? My guest on the program today will help us create perspectives and give insights into the dynamics of this discussion. Stay with me. Honorable Friday Ogera, he is a former member at Edo State House of Assembly, he's a lawyer, and he's also here to comment on many of these issues regarding the independence of the legislature. It's always a pleasure to have you on the program, Friday.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, I want us to begin with, I mean, you come with tangible experience as a legislator. How much of work did the House of Assembly in Edo State, for example, have to do in terms of ensuring it was independent vis-a-vis its interface with the executive?
The legislature and for Edo State, the Edo State House of Assembly has its own job cut out for it.
Right.
And that provision is to be found in the Constitution. Yes, it borders on making laws, ensuring that the executive and perhaps the judiciary do not overstep their bounds. That is within the contemplation of the doctrine of separation of power, bordering on checks and balance. And that way you may want to identify with that is when you hear hear it be said oversight function. So if really the Edo State House of Assembly is to be a case study of a proper legislature, I will tell you that they have more than enough to do, so much to do that for that 4 years in the first instance of a legislator being sworn into or inaugurated into office, there is so much to be done. And like I mentioned before, I specifically said legislation or making of laws. Then I also mentioned oversight functions. I also talked about the need for checks and balance, you know, as between the or amongst the tripartite arrangement of power between the executive, legislature, and the judiciary.
Right.
Now, that being the case, law making alone is an endeavor that is time consuming, is such that if that were to be the only assignment that the legislature would do, is sufficient to take the whole of their time, because it is law that regulates a democracy.
Sure. It
is law that regulates a society. Even if you were to have an authoritarian system, you still need to deal with laws. Where we had, where we were before the colonial era, when we had monarchies, there were laws, as it were, whether written or not. There were laws that you have to abide with. But now you now have a specific or a specialized arm of government that is set out and dedicated towards lawmaking. And because society is dynamic, to that extent of that dynamism, you have to have an upwardly mobile legislature that will also have to attend to the dynamism and the dynamics of society. You know, there are every day new system and new situation evolve, that perhaps you will have to have a piece of legislation to deal with it. And those states, as it were, like I mentioned before, as a case study, is not an exception. There are different issues we have to contend with, you know. So for me, going back to history and having personally been myself a legislator in the state, I can tell you that we have not even done up to 1/4 of what we are expected to do as a legislature.
Within 4 years?
I'm telling you, for within 4 years, and even since the inception. Since 1990. Since 1990 date, because we are looking at it as an overview,
right?
A holistic examination, not just perhaps when I was there or from a personal.
Of course.
But I can tell you, as an Edo state, as an Edo indigene, that looking at what the legislature ought to do, we have not really, utilized the time and the tenure, and of course the term, towards actually putting in place appropriate legislation that will regulate virtually all of our societal malaise. If we have the requisite laws that deal with them, you know, most of the bickering that we have, you know, wouldn't have been there. I can tell you that for
I want to ask you something quickly. I mean, executive, legislature, and then you have the judiciary. Is there supremacy? I mean, is one arm of government superior to the other?
Well, for those who contemplated the doctrine of separation of power, those political philosophers, it was never envisaged that one will be superior to the other.
Okay. In
fact, the appropriate situation or expectation is that they are equal and coordinate. They are equal and coordinated to the extent that they form a government, especially a constitutional government.
That's in principle.
In principle, ideally, it ought to be the same. It ought to be the situation, the reality.
Okay.
You know, but the way we seem to practice it here, for various reasons that perhaps we'll go into.
What are those reasons, for example?
In the course of this discussion, is that we tend to give so much preference or priority to the executive arm of government, which ought not to be so. And like I said, you see, the expectation in a constitutional democracy is that these three arms of government will be equal and coordinate.
Okay.
You know, strong enough and effective enough to be checks upon each and one another, as it were. So, but coming back home to our country, Nigeria, one of the imperfections in our own democracy is the fact that you still see some savience, you know, perhaps in the other two arms, but more perhaps especially and particularly the legislature, you know, being subservient to the executive. I can tell you, because I also double as a lawyer,
right,
that the kind of courage, despite some of the few bad acts in the judiciary, the kind of courage that have been seen and demonstrated in the judiciary, I don't think so much of that have been seen in the legislature. We have not seen that so much of that. And why is this so? There are so many reasons for it, and I'm going to mention some of them. There's this factor. That factor has to do with the fact that it has to do with our electoral system.
Okay. It
has to do with our electoral system, our leadership recruitment process, which is still less than satisfactory. It is still less than satisfactory. It is still so much lower than international expectation and standard. That being so, people owe their election to public offices, to certain individuals who have control of government machinery. And when you talk about control of government machinery in our climb, you are talking about the executive. And the executive, how do they control the machinery of government? So much of the finances, the fund available for government use is so much more in the hand of the executive.
How did you get to that point? Is that a default setting?
It's a default setting. It's a default setting to say that we have provisions in the law that ought to ensure that financial management and even distribution and administration is not one with which the executive can use to his own undue advantage.
Okay. But
what do we have? We have a system whereby, law, as it were, still take the back stage. Law and obedience to law in our own democracy still take the back stage. People do not pay so much attention to when laws are being abused. People do not have the wherewithal to even come up to challenge the executive, as it were, for the purpose of this discussion, right, when they tend to go outside their law, out of wires of their powers. They act outside their powers. They are outside with what is actually within the purview of their powers and authority. So people don't have the wherewithal to do that. It's only in very rare occasion we see people going to court to say, oh, you cannot do this, even if you are the governor, if you are the president, you cannot do this, you cannot go out of. But how many of our people have that wherewithal, have that knowledge, have what it takes to actually activate the due process that we are particularly taking matters before the court of law? So I tell you that when we come back to the issue why the legislature seem not to be up to their game, and not up to the up in their game of actually being a formidable arm of government to act as a check on the essence of the executive and perhaps the judiciary, it is because of the fact of where they are coming from. Most of them owe their allegiance to individuals who occupy some very powerful position in the executive. Only recently, I think that was yesterday, there was an article I flipped through written by a foremost constitutional lawyer in this country, Professor Ben Wambueze. Okay. When he was discussing the issue of personalization of power, how individuals personalize power. And if you when I read that through the article, and his quarrel really was with the executive. It is the executive, as we have it in Nigeria democracy, that have so much so, taking the law for a ride and taking people for a ride, taking them for granted, because the seeming weakness within the populace, and perhaps this the legislature, seem to embolden them to go on along that course, which of course we know in the long run is dangerous to our democracy.
There's a pendulum here. I mean, in a manner of speaking, where at one point you have a legislature that seems to be quote unquote friendly with the executive, and they say that legislature is rubber stamp. And then conversely, you have a legislature that's a bit more aggressive against, with the executive, railing against some policy statements of the executive, and they say this is very harsh, this is very unfriendly, there's no cooperation between both arms of government. How do we strike a balance? Because at one point you're seen as a puppet. The word we often hear of is rubber stamp. The next you hear is, okay, this executive is not this legislature is not cooperating with this executive to move the country or to move the state forward, as the case may be. So at what point do we have an ideal situation between both arms of government?
Yes. First, before we go to the actual question of when we'll have that ideal situation, right, I think the first thing to note here is that in our own system, those opinions that you have, they belong to the vocal minority. When people say, oh, legislature, this legislation is friendly, the other one is not friendly. They are the vocal minority, the minority, those ones that can afford to have a say, and they will be heard, you know, in the public space. It may not be so going deep down with the majority, because there is no way really to actually gauge what the people, how the people appreciate.
Yes, their impression,
their
assessment.
Thank you. There is no way to actually gauge it except perhaps you have a referendum.
Right.
You know, but like I mentioned, my experience would tell me that some of those opinions belong to the vocal minority, and it also belong to your own sentiment. You see, we are a people still very much bogged down,
right, by
certain primordial sentiments. If it suits me, if for instance, I can tell you, pardon me, if a Benin man or an Edo man were to be president of Nigeria today, and I find a senator, for instance, in the Federal Republic, you know, criticizing him, the likely expectation would be that my people will want me to condemn that legislator or senator, even if it's right. They want me to condemn it. Otherwise, if I am found to be very critical of the activities of that Mr. President or Mr. Governor, I will be left open to face the brunt. That is the reality. You are aware, of course, in our own state here, in our own state, or perhaps talking about Nigeria, we have a senator here who is still serving, who was once accused of toying with the issue of impeaching the president.
Right.
And what happened to him when he came to Benin? You are aware, it's on record. It was in the public space that he was harassed and molested at the Benin airport, only because he touted the issue of the possibility of the president being impeached. Nobody was interested in the reason or the motivation or the motives behind that move. So that is the lot. That is the lot of the legislator, and of course the legislature in Nigeria. It's all pervaded, it's everywhere. So until we rescue ourselves, we need to rescue ourselves first from those primordial sentiments, and to know that those duties that the legislator is voted to do, which I have said, I'm using the Edo State House of Assembly as an example, that we have not even done up to 1/3 of what the legislature, and that again extends to all the legislative houses across the country, whether state, local government, or the national. I want us to let me just mention, do you know that it is almost like the issue I mentioned, judging by that experience of that senator from Edo State,
right,
that it is almost like an abomination for anybody to ever contemplate the word impeachment. So again, the point I mentioned, yes, those primordial sentiments of ethnicity, of party affiliation, partisanship.
But what we saw at the Benin airport there, a lot of persons attributed it to, as you said, partisanship.
Yes,
the opposition elements.
Yes, which is very, very wrong and condemnable. Even as at the time was done, today and tomorrow.
Okay, good. On that note, we're going to take a quick break, everyone. We're back shortly to wrap up this discussion with Barrister Friday Ogiarake. So we'll begin to understand exactly where we are today and where we are heading or should be heading as far as the independence of the legislature is concerned. Stay with us. So I was going to ask you this Friday just before we took the break, but let's do that now. Where a legislature is not independent, there are ramifications, there are implications, like grave implications, right?
Well, under the law, first, the legislature ought to be independent.
Okay, that's in an ideal situation.
In an ideal situation, whether they would, those who are occupying the legislative seats, realizes their independence and also want to bring it to fruition, rest with them. And there are so many factors responsible for that. And perhaps it has to do with their orientation, and like I mentioned before, where they are coming from. If you now have a lame duck legislature a subservient legislature, a legislature that is looking at the face of the executive,
or body language,
of the executive. Then the society or the democracy, as it were, is in peril. So some of us are not really so surprised when you see the rudderlessness of our own democracy. Why people continue to refer to our democracy as a growing one?
Nascent
democracy. That is the word for it. But for me, perhaps we will never outgrow that nascent tag until all of the arms of government, the three arms as it were now, you know, come truly of age. They must come truly of age in all ramification. And coming truly of age will mean that only those, because you must look at the factor, the political factor, because occupying a legislative seat is a political issue.
Yeah,
it's a political function. So that how are they elected? Where are they coming from? What ideology does their party upholds? Is it a party that believes in democracy? So all of those things we impart on the whole on what the legislature is able to do. So until we have a legislature where you have very courageous legislators who do not have to kowtow, who do not have to go cap in hand,
right,
begging for survival from the executive or from a godfather, as it were. You know, until we have that, we may never be really able to celebrate that we are yet a democracy.
Let me ask you this as we wrap it up now. We've seen a number of committees at the House of Reps in particular now conducting budget defense for different ministries, departments and agencies of the government, federal government that is. And all of these MDs have been coming to defend their budgetary proposal for 2021. In the meantime, they're also now giving an appraisal. They're not giving the report of their budget performance for the current fiscal year, which is 2020. Some persons have pointed to some kid gloves handling of some of these agencies by the respective committees, while the committees come down hard on other persons who come to represent their agencies in terms of defending their budgets and also presenting their reports for, their budget performance for the current year. That's on the one hand. We saw at the National Assembly, for example, Senate to be precise, how that, circumstances around how a maize was taken away from the House, from the Senate.
Yes.
A lot of persons said this was not only embarrassing, it was something that nobody in their right mind would be proud of. The important thing I'm pointing out here is, at that time, we're starting to hear about allegations of executive interference. We've seen many cases where even at the state level, a speaker is impeached, within an hour or two, a new speaker is
installed.
Installed. And the next thing you hear is the governor who did it, is the deputy governor who did it, is the SSG who did it. Somebody from the executive is always fingered in all of these things. What does that say about interference by the executive, or at least the alleged interference of the executive in the affairs of the legislature?
Well, I'm happy that you went that far to bring in to make some historical references, which are not too palatable,
right?
As it were, for us as a people. The point is that all of this tell you a story of how the society continue to view the legislature as just an appendage, like a puppet of the almighty executive. That's the way they see it. when a speaker is removed, for instance, or there is a sacking of presiding officer of the legislature, they say, oh, the governor must be behind it. You know, the same will apply to the National Assembly. It tells you the mindset that we have. But it's, as it were, that actually is the reality, substantially. It is the reality. Nothing really happens in the state houses of assembly, or perhaps even the National Assembly, or by law even going below the councils, the legislative councils, without some interference from the executive. And the reason is not too far-fetched. It's not too far-fetched. It is still somewhat because the executive controls the purse, the fund, which the legislature runs, and
he will pay the piper.
The tune. If you know, like I can give you a personal example. Perhaps it might surprise you to know that when some of us in the Edo State Assembly, sometime in 2014, opted to join the People's Democratic Party, our salaries up to today were seized. Our monument and condition, other benefit, what you may call entitlement, were confiscated. The extent to which the executive will go to continue to intimidate and put the legislature, you know, down there, so that they can continue to enjoy this wholesome authority.
I'm afraid
that is just the situation.
Okay, where we find ourselves right now. When you are discussing issues like this, it's always a time. I mean, you're always a time constraint, especially when you have somebody like Barrister Friday Ogerahi, who has brought in a wealth of experience, not just as a lawyer, but a former legislator as well. Thank you so much for coming.
It's a pleasure.
We appreciate it. Okay, that's what we're leaving it this week on the program. I'm Uyi Agumofo-Egbe. Our coverage continues.
But